afternoon. We've made it till the very end. It's nice to see all of you. Again, my name's Maureen. I'm on the summit team here at Branching Minds. So excited to welcome you to our last thing of the summit, our closing keynote with Dr. Claudia Rinaldi. To get that started, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Yoni Tarone, who is our Chief Strategic Partnership Officer. He knows Dr. Rinaldi and is really delighted to introduce her and get us started. So Yoni, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maureen. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rinaldi, who will be delivering our closing keynote for our 2023 Virtual MTSS Summit. As Maureen said, my name is Yoni Tarone. I'm the Chief Strategic Partnership Officer at Branching Minds. This has been a really fun and full few days, and so we're grateful for all of you attendees who've made time to learn with us, for wonderful speakers and presenters. I do want to make a quick shout out. There have been so many people who have made these last few days possible, who have worked tirelessly to keep everyone organized, to organize this event, to make it so that we have time and space to grow and to learn. I know I have learned a lot from this conference, and so I'm really grateful. In particular, I want to thank Maureen Halton, who's just done such a wonderful job over months and months to organize this conference. So collectively, I hope we can have a round of applause for her. Thank you so much, Maureen. I will come back to you all afterwards to wrap up a few things. But right now, I would like to introduce Dr. Claudia Rinaldi. I've known Dr. Rinaldi for a few years now, and I've just been so grateful for her. She's been a wonderful advisor to Branching Minds. Also, as a leading expert on English language learners and delivering within the RTI and MTSS setting. It's very important for me. I'm the child of a English language learner teacher for 25 years. I spent many years of my childhood helping my mother in her classroom and hearing stories about her students. And so it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Rinaldi. Dr. Rinaldi is the Joan Weiler Arno Professor of Education and the Program Chair of Education at LaSalle University in Massachusetts. She has previously been a teacher, a researcher, consultant, and a professor of special education. Her research addresses the implementation of RTI and MTSS in urban settings with a focus on supporting English language learners, which is why we're so happy to have her here today. Her experience engaging educators on how to improve systems and instructional practices for students with reading difficulties who may be at risk for failure. In talking with school districts across the country, we've heard so many of you that you need more tools and resources to be able to effectively support multilingual learners. Dr. Rinaldi is an expert on this topic, and so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rinaldi to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. This is so exciting. I love being the closing keynote and letting everybody go home afterwards. So I got the lucky part today. Welcome everybody to my session. I am excited to be able to share some of the information that I have been researching and helping school districts to implement. And so I hope that that today we can bring you some support as you continue the process of implementation. Today's talk is really looking at roadblocks and opportunities for improving implementation. So this is not a beginning session. This is really looking at what I am seeing in the field that is causing school districts to kind of either have a slowdown or a halt or an inconsistent implementation methods of MTSS, and with a particular focus on, the population of students that is usually the impact of this poor implementation or just slow to progress implementation, which are multilingual learners. Today, I will review a little bit of the current challenges in the field very briefly. I will highlight some aspects of what makes the cultural implementation very possible, identify some roadblocks and opportunities for implementation, and then leave with a couple strategies for you to take over for the implementation with a focus on multilingual learners. Before we start, I know you probably all need a little bit of a moving break. And even if you don't move, I want you to watch this video. It's about 2 minutes and it should be engaging as we begin. I want you to think about why I asking you to watch this 2-minute video as we identify with a character in it, and then how that translates into our practice in schools. Go ahead, Maureen.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with the crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed looking at the shirtless guy and his first followers. And, what we hope is that you could think about whether you are that first follower or whether you are going to be recruiting these followers to kind of help you address the aspects of implementation that are not happening for our multilingual learners. So think about that as you hear this. And let's jump right into a couple of data points that I just wanted to share, because part of the challenge with multilingual learners is that we are having them and seeing them more disproportionately represented in special education. And so I wanted to put a context in the numbers that from 2012 to 2020, where the number of English learners identified with a disability continues to increase. So it's about 11% now. It's increased 2 points, which is quite significant. And so MTSS really offers an opportunity for us to really serve these students ahead of time if we could do it correctly. So we're going to be looking at these roadblocks and what opportunities to make sure that we are doing that correctly. When you look at this percentage, I want to make sure that you realize it's about 790,000 kids around the country, and it represents about 11% of all students with this 13% of students with disabilities have a disability, and they represent about 11% of those. So it is a significant number. I feel that at many times when schools and school districts don't know the exact number of dually identified students, then we don't think that there are that many. And in this process of over-identification, I think those numbers will continue to rise. And part of what MTSS offers us is the ability to monitor those numbers and ensure that that's not happening in your district. So to put that context into roadblocks I'm seeing in the field, I identified 4 areas that really I see continually as I visit schools. One is that some educators are not part of your MTSS model in schools. And so what I want you to think about is, how do we use this shirtless guy example to really bring every member of your team, of your school, of your district into being part of the MTSS model. This is a hands-on model approach. Everybody has to be part of it in order for it to work. And so knowing whether there are people who feel they're not part of it is really an important piece and low-hanging fruit that we can address right away. Some of the examples that I hear in the field is that, oh, this is the special ed team work, this is the MTSS team, but I'm not in that team, or this is the child study team meeting that does this work, but I have nothing to do with it. That tells me right away that they are not doing tier 1 correctly and that we need to go back to it, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. The second roadblock I see is educators having conflicting information about when and how to support multilingual learners who are obviously learning English. And so, for example, one of the things that I hear a lot is, well, they're getting tier 2 intervention in ESL. So, ESL is part of tier 1 instruction, and providing clarity in your policies and procedures of MTSS implementation is really critical. ESL should be part of every tier of intervention, but certainly tier 1 is where it begins. Roadblock 3 is educators inadvertently receiving the message to wait until multilinguals in English speakers speak before referring them to special education. So that, again, is breaking the MTSS model. What we want to make sure is that we have policies and procedures in place that tells us how many cycles of response to that intervention are the students going through, and what changes to the intervention are making an impact or not, and then looking to see when we refer to special education, regardless of which English language level they're at. And the last roadblock is educators not knowing how to monitor English learners. So I'll give you some research around that and what we should be doing effectively, and I have a short little example to show you on that. So if we look at the triangle, I kind of identified the roadblocks in the triangle. So if you see here, roadblock number 1 addresses universal core instruction. Roadblock 2 is looking at what is specifically unique for multilingual English learners. Roadblock 3 is on progress monitoring, and roadblock 4 is really what happens if we don't do a fidelity of implementation of MTSS structures on a yearly basis. Some key aspects to look at this, which you've probably seen in many triangles of MTSS and RTI, is that we should be looking at assessment and instruction, screening and progress monitoring, and we should be looking at both sides of the academic and socio-emotional sides. Obviously, for multilingual learners, our best model right now, tested by research, is dual language programs. Obviously, most schools don't have those dual language programs, but if you are, the model works the same. And what we should be thinking about is whether interventions could be in either language. So you could go back and forth on interventions that are strategy-based rather than package-based, like the ones Branching Minds recommends in their tool, so that we are able to go seamlessly between one language and the other. So let's go back to roadblock 1, which is tier 1 instruction, and what's happening that is not really allowing our multilingual learners to make progress. So one is the research has been identifying this for the last 10 years, that there's low fidelity of core or tier 1, making it difficult to determine the cost of learning difficulties of English learners. So, are we really truly teaching the literacy areas? Are we really teaching behavior? Or are we kind of assuming the students will pick it up? And so for the English learners, of course, this is not going to work. We also have tier 1 instruction that is not culturally relevant, so I'll talk about that in a little bit, or that it has an ORC component. And what we know is that English learners benefit from instruction and intervention that includes an ORC component. And ORC refers to the ability to use language to learn academic and interpersonal skills at the same time. So is how do we engage the students in our classrooms to be practicing the language as they're learning academic language. Oftentimes what we see is a lot of teacher talk, a lot of teacher-directed instruction with very minimal or teacher-student interaction rather than a lot of the student-to-student mediated learning so that they are teaching each other through their own language skills and abilities and vocabulary, how they're mediating that language. So those are part of the aspects of the roadblock tier 1 that we should be looking at. One intervention that is really great is, of course, thinking about what strategies like peer-assisted learning strategies, cooperative learning, cross-age peer tutoring, same grade page tutoring that will allow for this ORC to happen naturally between the students. And so again, if we think of ORC as being in the forefront of lesson planning and of tier 1 intervention, then we're going to be embedding some culturally relevant, explicit instructional strategies that the students are actually practicing and applying and moving through the actual active learning that we are requiring that they do. So one way to look at whether we're doing that is really thinking about how culturally and linguistically responsive our classrooms are. And so this is something that you could bring to your educators in your schools, or if you're an educator, things that you could look at. And so it's really breaking down culturally and linguistically responsive practices into these different areas. One is the philosophy in the classroom. Are we truly of the belief that having a multicultural curriculum and a cultural responsive practice is going to address the needs of all our learners? And I don't know that we're all there. So really discussing your philosophy is key. Looking at the learning environment, do the students see themselves represented as their multicultural books and curriculum that are available? And are we embedding an asset-based lens in those classrooms through the learning environment? The third area is the actual curriculum. So again, there's a lot of efforts around the country around looking at anti-bias curriculum, DEI practices, but really, how well are we doing that? And so in the next page, I'll show you an example of a culturally responsive curriculum scorecard that you could access free from NYU Steinhardt School of Education that can allow a group of educators in a school or the district to really review the curriculum and see whether it is culturally relevant. The next aspect of cultural linguistic responsive is instruction. So is our instruction really embedding the students where they are? Are we picking up where they are? Are we activating that prior knowledge? Are we using sheltered English strategies like, using the native language to help that instruction happen? Are we using assistive technology tools that allow students to access the curriculum, removing barriers? The next aspect is assessment. So is our assessment culturally and linguistically responsive? And unfortunately, a lot of it's English only. So when we're looking at our multilingual learners and our English learners, we need to think about assessment in a wider lens rather than just a test or a tool that we use. We need to be looking at how do we learn, how much they're learning during instruction and during the completion of their academic learning. So again, when we look at these, we should be having conversations about each one of these areas, and we should be doing it in a multidisciplinary group. So as much as you can coordinate multidisciplinary groups that include the general educator, the bilingual educator, the ESL educator, to kind of go over, this perspective. It's a really key aspect. And again, something that is not, very difficult to implement, but that we sometimes overlook. And I'll provide some strategies on how to do that as well. In the blue box on the side, you'll see free professional development from the Vanderbilt University Iris Center on Culturally Responsive Teaching, and a tool from that provides a primer on culturally responsive teaching from the Institute of Education Sciences as well. So those links you could go to after the session. So if we look at this opportunity of redefining our tier one, instruction should include all these aspects of culturally centered, learner-centered, linguistically strengthening curriculum that is really promoting student learning. And when you have even students with disabilities, then we also must include and address those language needs in our lesson plan in inclusive settings and in special education settings. So you'll see around our picture here of these two, little boy and little girl, looking at aspects that are right now in the research telling us that create a really culturally and strong responsive tier one instruction. Those include universal design for learning, which allows teachers to, in the pre-planning stage, to really think about what removals to use. We have evidence-based explicit oracy instruction, which I addressed a little bit, but there's plenty of evidence-based practices that are available. Anti-bias curriculum, which we'll look at in a second. Connected funds of knowledge from what the students bring from their culture and language. Applied and scaffolded instruction and asset-based in practice, having the students represented in your curriculum, like I was saying, and of course that collaboration piece that happens between the ESL, general education, and special education. Oops. So I was looking at this opportunity to evaluate our curriculum and then multidisciplinary team. I wanted to show you a picture of what the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU culture responsive scorecard looks like. So if you go to their webpage, you could download it. They have it for every subject, including math and the other subjects and lower and secondary levels. And really is a sort of a survey that you go through that asks the questions that would tell us whether our curriculum is actually culture responsive. And if not, it allows the team to then come together and say, how can we add or redefine the aspects of this curriculum so that it is embracing our students who are multilingual learners learning English, and so that they can feel represented and addressing a stronger tier one that addresses most kids. As a litmus test, what we want is at least 80% of students responding to tier one, meaning they're at grade level. And so if you have anything less than 80%, it is time to go back to the table and look at these areas of what makes this tier one stronger and more culturally relevant for our populations. We'll move to roadblock 2, and that is the role of universal design for learning across all tiers. So if you have not heard of universal design for learning, it's been around for about 20 years. It has taken more of a steep adoption in the last few years. But what I love about universal design is that research is telling us that it really focuses a lot on the pre-planning and the mindfulness of the teacher as they're thinking about instruction and intervention, and what barriers are we creating based on the way that we teach. So when we look at universal design, we're really looking at setting clear, rigorous goals, but anticipating those barriers. And so this figure here kind of shows you, how barriers can easily be put up. But what happens when we take them down? So thinking about getting the teachers to think about, for example, having multilingual books available rather than just books where the students don't see themselves may increase engagement in the classroom. It also, like I said, focuses on proactive planning so that we are ahead of the game, thinking about how to have different entry points for learning for students, and thinking about those students that learn and think differently. So it's not just thinking this is the way I'm going to teach and they better learn it this way because that's the way I teach, but it's really thinking about, okay, if I need to get this goal into or the standard taught, what are some entry points that we can have so that more students can access it? And there are tools that are nicely developed, and I'll show you a couple examples in a second, that allows the teachers to do this. And of course, because we're doing that, we're valuing variability and diversity, and we're also valuing peer-to-peer interaction, which is that high oracy aspect that I mentioned in the first roadblock. Here is, and it has the URL link, so if you're curious about this, here's an example of how you could remove barriers as you're planning. And so as we look at the 3 areas of universal design for learning, multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression, this guides a teacher through the planning process and asking themselves these questions such as, do the students care about the content? How do I make sure that they're interested in the content, that they're motivated to learn? And I just had this conversation with a student yesterday in my teacher preparation program. They're like, the student is completely disengaged. And I'm like, let's think about that. Why is that happening? What engages you when you're learning? So this flowchart kind of helps teachers to think about that ahead of time. If we moved into the other areas, of course, we have other guiding questions. Do the students understand the concept? And is the student able to show what they know? And so are we providing multiple options for them to show based on their strengths and their ability and their language? So that is one of the ways that, we kind of are trying to change the way that teachers are planning so that we are providing access to the curriculum and removing barriers. In this tool, you'll see in the URL and the page before, it guides you to 3 pages that provide a lot of really great additional questions with recommendations for addressing those questions. So I won't go over that. I wanted to show you some tools that you could then take home this afternoon and this evening and kind of look forward or, do them with your team at your next team meeting so that you could go over this and see how that could be applied to strengthen your tier 1 and your interventions as well. So this is an example of the removing barriers in representation and removing barriers in action and expression. And again, changing the goal of what am I going to teach the student to how I'm going to make this student an expert learner in my classroom. And I think, again, changing that perspective and that paradigm of, here's what I have to teach to how am I going to make the student an expert in my classroom really changes the perspective of how we teach and how we can strengthen tier 1. So I hope that you take some of these tools back to your teams, talk about them, see how you can embed them, and change that aspect of traditional teaching that requires one way of showing how you learn and one way of teaching, and whether you get it or not, that's not my problem. We want to engage all the students as much as possible to address particularly our multilingual learners who may need access through a different language or a different visual support strategy. As we move to roadblock 3 is, one of the gold standards of MTSS, and is, are we really progress monitoring, and are we progress monitoring multilingual learners? Because if we're not progress monitoring at all, I can guarantee we're not progress monitoring multilingual learners. So this is a major roadblock. I think a lot of school districts are still very slow to progress monitor. Not all teachers are aware of what to do when they're progress monitoring. And so it is really key for us to think about not only are the teams progress monitoring in that fidelity of implementation, but what is different for our students who are multilingual learners. So in the top of the slide, I show a summary of the scheduling that should be done for that progress monitoring. And of course, we know that for all students it's 3 times a year. And then we go to a more consistent training progress monitoring schedule. But for multilingual learners, which is a really key aspect of this conversation, is that in dual language schools, we must progress monitor in both languages. And progress management could take at various ways. So it could be curriculum-based measures, which are now coming in multiple languages. But when those languages are not the ones that are in your classroom, we can also have observational tracking. And so what we want to make sure is that we are using multiple measures to address the unique needs of our English learners, and that multiple teachers are doing that reporting. So it is more time consuming for them, but the information that you get really allows you to disentangle what is a learning disability or what is learning language that is interfering with the learning of your English learners. Some diagnostic assessments are also available in multiple language. For math, for example, you have Key Math that is available in Spanish and English, and it is diagnostic in nature. So, I think thinking about beyond. Informal reading inventories are coming in multiple languages, so that is another way. And then observational tracking, I'll be showing you how you could use some of the, if you're a WIDA state, you could use some of the WIDA descriptors, or you could have your own descriptors from your state like California and New York, to kind of put them in a sheet that you can monitor on a monthly basis. And the teacher, the ESL teacher, gen ed teacher, even a SPED teacher could be monitoring what the student is able to do as they hear them in the classroom and outside the classroom. And that serves as a progress monitoring tool. And the other key aspect of the CREASE monitoring is ensuring that it's happening every 4 to 6 weeks. So scheduling becomes an issue. And so what I did was I also provided you with some examples of guidance from the research on how to do scheduling to allow this to happen. Before that, I wanted to just show you a quick example of, for example, these two kids and how it might look different as we go through the MTSS model. So in the left, you have Sam, and on the right, you have Isabel. And Sam is a monolingual English speaker, and he goes through universal screening. There's diagnostic assessment that tells us how to support him in which of the 5 areas of literacy. We provide an intervention in the area of literacy in need, and then we progress and monitor every 4 to 6 weeks and decide whether we maintain the intervention, we decrease it, increase it, and then go another cycle before we decide what to do with Sam. And I'll show you some data on how that looks different. On the other side, we have Isabel. Isabel is a non-English speaker. She is a speaker of a different language, and so the universal screener should be done in multiple languages, in the native language and in English. And we should be trying to gather information of what she is able, if we don't have a test, of what she is able to do in the areas of literacy and math, if she is not an English speaker and does not have enough English to share that. Then we have the same diagnostic assessment as in SAM, but again, we're looking at both English and the native language, and that could be done again through informal assessments, or it could be done through classroom observations. And so what we want to know is, how are they responding to instruction, right? We call that dynamic assessment. We teach, we watch how they respond, we gather data on that, and then we reteach it again and see whether the child's learning. And that allows us to know, how they're taking in the instruction happening in the classroom and how they'll respond to intervention. So we don't give it enough weight, but the informal assessment observation is very key for the multilingual learners. And so setting up a unique team to do that would be a really great idea. The other aspect that is different for these multilingual learners learning English are the parent interview. We need to interview parents. They are the best ones to tell us whether they read at home, whether they love math, whether they're engaged socially, whether they're like their other children. And so, not letting go of that interaction with the family to kind of learn more about what helps and what works for the multilingual learner. And then the fourth part of that is really looking at a true peer comparison, which is what research is telling us. And that true peer comparison is a peer that also is a non-native English speaker. So it's learning English and with the same characteristics as possible. For example, what country they're from, whether they have siblings, whether they are in the same English language level, in the same courses, because that true peer tells us whether developmentally the process of learning English is happening similarly or not similarly. And so it allows us to, again, disentangle what kind of intervention, but if multiple cycles are not producing results and gains, then it allows us to know whether it's a time to refer or not. And again, as part of all this, the diagnostic, the parent interview, and the true peer comparison, we should be involving the ESL teacher at all points, because they're the ones who know the student, again, the most if they're providing the direct service, but they also have data that they're collecting themselves that could be used in a more whole child approach to developing those data-driven, evidence-based interventions. And then the progress monitoring would happen, again, depending on the student. It could happen in English. It could happen in English and the native language, depending if there are lower native language instruction and the language of instruction and an intervention. So I wanted to just kind of share and highlight those additional and different things that are aspects of this difference. In the scores, you could kind of see it. So I included some samples of scores, but you could see that Sam and Isabel are not the same child. And so we can't be providing the same intervention. We need more information. And where you begin seeing that universal screening data take very a different approach is here. It's in the oral reading fluency, words read correctly. Not in these other areas. So we must look at the data and then move through the cycle of diagnostic assessment in native language and English, a parent interview, true peer comparisons, and really be able to make that distinction of what the child may need with the guidance of the ESL teacher. The next aspect of it is an example of a form that I created. Is in one of the articles that I've written before that I've linked to as well. But this provides the importance, or it reminds us of the importance of keeping track of those problem-solving data meetings, progress monitoring meetings every 4 to 6 weeks. And in this particular form, what I liked when I created it was that we're reminding ourselves, what is the data? Are we delivering tier 1 as intended? And that is really key. Is ESL part of it? Is it intended? Was it delivered? And tier 2 is the same way. A lot of times I think we think about, we're going to provide this intervention and nobody's really monitoring whether the student's actually being taken out and whether there's an oracy component to it. So keeping track in a written format, whether it's Google Docs or paper, it's really important to ensure that we are monitoring the progress of our multilingual learners. And then the opportunity here is, making sure that as a district and as a school and even as a grade, that we are monitoring the different data points for each of the students, right? So we want to monitor by English language level how they're making progress. So how are all English language level 3s making progress in our interventions? How are all students with disabilities? What about dually identify English learners with disabilities and how they're responding to interventions? So really breaking down the data very specifically by subgroup to know whether we're going to have to revisit co-instruction, whether we need to change or increase or change the intervention, and whether we are actually progress monitoring. And so if we have a structure to the data progress solving meetings that allows us to group, to look at these subgroups, then we're sure that we're implementing the model correctly. All right, and that moves us into roadblock 4. So I am moving right along. I think we're right on time. And that is, are we progress monitoring your own implementation of MTSS, or what we call fidelity of implementation? And so this is key. And I see very small number of school districts doing this, or for that matter, districts. So it could be done at the district level, at the school level. And so it needs to happen at least once a year. I would love it just as a universal screener to happen 3 times a year, but at the rate that I don't see it, at least once a year allows you to monitor whether we're doing all the aspects of implementation, whether everyone is involved, whether all the components of multi-tier system of support like leadership, building capacity, communication and collaboration, data-based problem solving, the instructional and intervention model, the data evaluation is actually happening. And because it is a lot, it allows us to also plan the next steps for implementation the following year or the next 6 months. So it allows everybody to keep thinking and developing and learning about what we should be doing to improve the model. There are a lot of tools out there, maybe not a lot, but maybe about 5 or 6 that I really like. The link here is for the Florida RTI out of the University of South Florida, which I really love. And I love it because what you'll see in a couple examples is that it allows you to learn through the rubric completion of the self-assessment. So you're reading each section and it adds to each level of the module of the rubric. And so as you're reading, you're reminding yourself, oh yes, that's where we need to get to. That's where we need to get to. And so this makes it really great. So I'm going to provide, I picked some examples from it, from the different areas. And just to kind of show you how, you would score yourself as not implementing, emerging or developing, operationalizing and optimizing. And then, of course, you have the question. In this case, for example, the first one reads, student progress specific to academic, behavior, and socio-emotional goals specified in the intervention plans are monitored. So this one's talking about monitoring. And so it says progress monitoring does not occur and the student progress is not evaluated. And then if we go to optimizing, you have to read number 2, which is the learning piece of this, which is plans for monitoring progress towards expected student outcomes are developed, but is operationalizing if they're not only developed, but in most cases they're collected to monitor student progress and intervention with fidelity. And then it's optimizing when the teams get to a point where the changes are made to instruction and intervention based on student responses. So I added a few examples. I'm not going to go over them all, but I just wanted to give you a sampler where the tool is there. Again, the link to the tool is right here at the bottom of this slide in the Florida RTI, but I'll also give you the link to others from the American Institutes for Research and others that are out there. So let me show you those. I'm going to jump. Let's see, I think that one is in a different slide. As we come to close here, what I wanted to do in the last 10 minutes is really give you resources to go from here. This was a jumping of the roadblocks for very cute, very quick solutions that you could think about. But in reality, going deeper is really what we need to do. So here's an article that I published and a chapter that I recently published if you're curious about, again, helping EL succeed in an MTSS framework. And it has the access to those worksheets where you would capture what the student is getting. The chapter is more specifically on when do you refer to special education, so you can look at that. And then I added more examples on the self-assessment related to other aspects. So I'm gonna, this one deals with leadership. So for example, if you're scoring low on leadership, one of the examples and opportunities that you have is for leaders to review the organizational structure or how every team member is involved in MTSS in your school. And so again, a heavy focus on, who wraps around the student, but who wraps around the grade, who wraps around the school leadership, and who wraps around the school district level. And again, keeping in mind that at all these levels, we need to have multidisciplinary representation, particularly for our English learners and our students with disabilities, to ensure that everybody is involved and that the model is truly happening for all of them. I provided, again, links to additional readings and supports that could help you. The National Center of MTSS has a great tool for evaluation, just like the one from the Florida RTI Center. The IRIS modules have 14 modules on related topics to MTSS implementation. The National Center for Systemic Improvement also has really great resources and webinars if you need something like this, to additional content to kind of bring to your teams. And then we move to building capacity. I provided some example of building capacity of an infrastructure. So this one is about scheduling, because I brought scheduling becoming difficult up before earlier in the chat. So scheduling is one of those that this tool in the Florida RTI asks. This is schedules provide adequate time to administer academic, behavioral, and socio-emotional assessment needed to make database decisions. And again, a lot of school districts are not there, and helping schools to kind of think outside the box as to how we could do scheduling. I provided some links to tools that have been written on helping you kind of either develop an intervention block or developing scheduling that would help the implementation that's currently happening. And again, this is, sometimes I feel that school districts get stuck on the way that they did the schedule, and so they don't know how to do it. But I've been in school districts, urban and suburban, where, teachers are planning half hour, 45 minutes every day. And I've been to school districts that they only got it once a month. So somebody's got to figure out. And what we need is for all of you to figure it out, so that there is data-driven problem solving happening continually in the schools to be able to truly implement MTSS. I also provided you here like a flow chart of, for multilingual learners going through and what they're supposed to get, because there is some lack of clarity around, is ESL is a tier 2 intervention. So ESL is part of tier 1. It should also be part of tier 2 and tier 3, but it should not be tier 2 or tier 3, right? Is the consultation or maybe delivery of the ESL support, but really as an additional layer of this. And the same thing for students with disability or dually identified. So I thought I'd include that as a resource for you that you could look over later. And then another area that I wanted to kind of address was communication and collaboration domain of the self-assessment. So, one of the questions here is, does staff have consensus and engagement in MTSS implementation? And again, I've been telling you all along, this is really key and important in ensuring that everyone in the school, in each school, is involved in the aspect of implementing MTSS, whether they're in science or home economics or PE. Everybody has a role in supporting the implementation of MTSS. I provided then again a couple other connections to resources that you could look at before. I didn't want to leave you without resources because I think in every one of these examples there is a connection that you could then read further. Obviously 45 minutes of me talking is not going to do it, so we want to make sure you had somewhere to go afterwards. In the database problem solving domain, one example is across OTO's data are used to identify the difference or gap between expected and current students' outcomes relative to academic behavior and social emotional gain. So again, we're looking at how data is used and whether we could look at group data, like I was suggesting earlier, to make sure that those English learners are making progress, but that they're not lumped as one group, but we're really looking at, dually identified and also by English language level. I'm going to skip to that. And I'm going to show you some of the unique links here. So the Progress Center, the U.S. Department of Education Progress Center, is just released a data-cased individualization for English learners. That is a really great online tool that teams could go through together to kind of learn how to do that individualization for identifying interventions. There's also a few reports on the What Works Clearinghouse that are research-based, again, on kind of looking at the use of database problem solving for effective implementation, database decision-making, identifying intensive interventions. And so I want to make sure that you have different places where you could go to see some great resources that are coming together. In the 3-tier instruction and intervention domain, again, it looks at, reviewing tier 1. This is why it's really important that I wish every school and every district, require the schools to do this self-assessment, because it is making you go back to tier 1. So this one says tier 1 academic practices exist that clearly identify learning standards, school-wide expectations for instruction that engages students and school-wide assessment. So there is your UDL, there is your ORAC, and so, in the scoring, you could look to see how at each scoring level, the requirements grow here. So they become more explicit on academic and behavior. And again, the goal of this self-assessment is to become better, to improve, to create the next step in the implementation process. So it's really key as you look to this, what the goal not used as a punitive aspect of evaluation, but just look as a action planning aspect of implementation. And I'm going to skip again to link to the opportunities. And so there is here guidance for tier 2 and tier 3 in instruction and intervention. Some of them are from the Intensive Intervention Center, the IRIS modules, again, that I've gone but to different links. The high leverages practices in special education, the tools chart for assessment intervention. So if you're looking for assessment in multiple languages, the Intensive Intervention Center will give you some. There's an article that I wrote that I showed you earlier. And so again, the comparison chart program for English learners from the What Works Clearinghouse. So I'm hoping that here, with all the resources I gave, you could find something that really speaks to your unique needs or where you are. I then also wanted to show what happens if the students are not making progress, right? What is the next step for our English learners if we need to refer them to special education? When is the right time? And so I wanted to highlight a tool from the U.S. Department Office of English Language Acquisition, and it is called their toolkit. And so this toolkit has Chapter 6, and Chapter 6, it provides a really great charts to help the multidisciplinary team make that decision. And the chart is right behind. So they have multiple pages where you could go through each aspect of these areas. So they go through oral comprehension, speaking and oral fluency, phonemic awareness, reading comprehension and vocabulary, writing, math, and behavior, and spelling. And then they look at how the learning behavior is manifested, indicators of language difference, and indicators of possible learning disability. So this is a great tool after 2 or 3 cycles of implementation where you're trying to determine, Should we refer to special education? Use these tools, put them in the center of your table. Be able to make sure that you look at with your team and that everybody has input, because everybody knows the child from a different perspective. The gen ed teacher sees them in a big group. The ESL teacher sees them in a small group. The special ed teacher sees them in an even smaller group. So we want all the feedback from here to know what we should do next. The Office of English Language Acquisition, again, has also added to the toolkit. So here are the toolkits. They have a family kit. They have other toolkits that I think might be really key for you. And they also have some fact sheets and infographics. So I just wanted to include a slide from there. We also had published an article on RTI-based SOD identification that still stays true to MTSS. So what are those considerations as part of MTSS that we should be thinking about for those English learners? So again, you could look at that one. The link is there. And we've come to the end. So I'm at 3:50 exactly, so that we can have some time for questions and kind of move from there, Joni.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claudia. Yay. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions, and so I would love to take the next 5 or 10 minutes or so to be able to get to those.
Sure.
Anna, or let me start with, Anna asks, should Tier 2 be implemented in the first year of a student learning English, or should progress monitoring be done with the English ELL teacher?
Okay, so let's start with the first part of the question is, should they be receiving tier 2 intervention in the first year? I'd say yes, why not? All the other students, this is part of general education, right? If they are not up to grade level, then we should be. Now, what we should be doing in that tier 2 should be consulted with the ESL teacher, or it should be done in the native language, right? So that adds a little bit of a caveat to it. But you're not going to just have one student. You're going to have probably a group of students. And so how do you group them together, and what kind of intervention would be more relevant to them than just have them sitting in a traditional, computer-based intervention, or, an intervention that is in English only. So keeping in mind that is also really important. And the second part is, should we progress monitor? Was that the question, Johnny? Oops, I can't hear you.
Oh.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay. Should progress monitoring be done with the ELL teacher?
Yes, I think the ELL teacher is one of those people that can be reporting on the progress of that informal progress, right? Particularly for level 1s and 2s and maybe 3s, right? Because we could look at descriptors at those levels, and the ESL teacher is the one that sees the most the student probably. And so, they could report as well as a general education teacher reporting what they see. Remember that our English learners are probably going to be very quiet in the general classroom, right? They don't want, they don't know how to speak. They may be going through a silent period. They're embarrassed. They're shy, whatever the issue may be. But in the ESL classroom or with a bilingual teacher, they may be very different. They may be very vocal and, in their native language, or, in their practicing of their beginning English skills. So we want them reporting how they're seeing the language grow. And that is progress monitoring for them.
Great. Thank you so much. Shelby writes in to ask, does the ELPA work as a universal screener for EL students, or is there another assessment that works better?
So I'm not familiar with the ELPA by letters, so I'm not sure. But if you're talking about an English language assessment, which it sounds like it probably is, like either WIDA or like California has their own, New York has their own. Yes, it could serve as part of the data collection that happens in the universal screening process. I think the message I'm trying to send is, the more information we have about the child, the better identification of what intervention they need, right? So if we have that and we know how the child responded to the teacher when they were testing, that's valuable information that will allow us to know what kind of intervention would work for them.
Right. Another question is, Jessica asks if you have a resource to share regarding what the parent interview should look like.
Okay, so the parent interview, it's really great. If you go to that toolkit, chapter 6 is the one I showed you on one of the last slides. If you go to an earlier chapter, the Office of English Language Acquisition has created really in-depth parent interviews. So rather than the 2 questions that we ask or 3 questions that we ask to put a child in ESL, this one actually provides a very lengthy, I mean, not lengthy in a bad way, but more comprehensive list of questions. But in general, what you want to think about is questions like, oh, can you tell me a little bit about, whether you have books at home? Does your child like reading? Do they read when you go out to the grocery store? Do they read to their pets, or do they read to the brother and sister, or does the brother and sister read to them? Do you think they know the letters in Spanish or in Portuguese or whatever the language may be? You're just trying to get awareness of what they're doing. I remember about 25 years ago, I went into a classroom, in a self-contained classroom for children with cognitive disabilities, to follow a little girl as part of a research project. And come to find out, after I spoke to her for about 10 minutes, I realized the kid was actually fully fluent in Spanish, was at grade level in Spanish, and nobody had noticed that, and she was in 3rd grade, right? In a self-contained classroom for cognitive disabilities. That still happens today. You might not want to think it does, but it still does. So getting to know the child is really important, and the parents could really answer that. If somebody would have interviewed that parent would have said, oh, I read to my child every day, and she's actually reading in Spanish, right? So it's really getting to know them and getting information, because remember, they're the first teacher of their child, and they may be doing things. Not everybody is illiterate, and not everybody is doing reading, but many are. And so we can't do the same blanket intervention for all English learners.
Thanks. Another question we had is about what are some LL programs that you would recommend?
L programs. Do you think they mean curriculum, maybe?
I suppose so.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to say about that. I know many people feel they need to have an EL curriculum. I urge you to think back to the beginning of the presentation and really evaluate your Tier 1 curriculum for cultural responsiveness, right? Are our students represented in it? Are there access levels for multilingual students? I think if we had that, we wouldn't need an additional curriculum. We could capitalize on showing the students the same information in the gen ed class as in the pull-out ESL instruction, right? But right now, they're learning 2 languages, so they have a double burden. They're learning English, and they're still trying to, learn the academics. And then we give them 2 curriculums, right? The general education curriculum, which may miss when they go out of the classroom, and then we give them an ESL curriculum. So I think we should go back to the table and say, okay, what curriculum are we using? How can the curriculum work to address the needs of multilingual learners? What can we add? What can we change? Or we need to adopt a new one and really push the field, the publishing companies, to do it and to do it right. So I know that's hard. So I'm not really answering the question.
No, but I think that was very, very, very helpful, and I think that's actually a great place to end things today. From everything that you've shared, I want to thank Claudia for having such passion and such a mission in her work. I know all of you who have attended this conference with us have that as well in your work, and I really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Joni. Same for you and Branching Minds. You've done an amazing job in looking at the needs of English learners from the start, and that is something I love about your product.
Well, thank you so much. With that, I do want to share a couple more minutes, take a couple more minutes of your time. I know you all have spent so much time with us, so I really, really appreciate that. What I just wanted to share is that, there we go. Now I'm stuck on my slides, but I wanted to thank so many of you for attending this conference, for all of our speakers, our presenters, our attendees, all those who've been organizing this conference from behind the scenes. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. So thank you. Oops, there we go. At Branching Minds, our goal is to help make MTSS efficient, effective, and equitable, and ultimately to help make your MTSS vision a reality. So whether you're just dipping your toe into MTSS or looking to refine your practice, we'd love to partner with you in this work. reaching out to us to learn more about our infrastructure, coaching, or customized PD, or to learn about our MTSS platform can help you more effectively support students, save time for your teachers, streamline communication and collaboration, and gain visibility into what's working and what isn't. So don't wait until the end of the year. See if your outcome, please feel free to reach out to us. If not, we will reach out to you. But we hope you have a chance to look into Branching Minds as well. If you're not quite ready for that step yet, which we totally understand, we encourage you to check out some of our free MTSS resources. We have a lot of resources on our website. Please check them out. We have tons of guides and webinars, blogs, toolkits. We have a wonderful podcast. Check it out, subscribe, listen to it, share with your friends, colleagues, both in your own district, your own schools, and colleagues and friends in other schools as well. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. We'd love to connect with you. And finally, and I think that's it. We hope you have a wonderful holiday season. We hope you will join us next year in 2024. We look forward to continuing this summer in the future. Thank you again so much.